Maravale hadn't spoken to another human being in 4 months when she found the dying man in the snow. Every ounce of sense screamed at her to keep walking. She had barely enough firewood to last the week, and her own stomach had been empty for 2 days. But the stranger's horse was still standing, steam rising from its flanks, and something in the animal's eyes made her stop. She didn't know his name yet, didn't know he was worth killing for. All she knew was that saving him might cost her everything she had left. If you're ready to see how far desperation can push two people who refuse to quit, stay with me to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wind came down off the ridge like something alive and hunting. Mara pulled her coat tighter, though it did nothing. The wool was threadbare in places, and the cold found every gap. She'd been checking the trap line for an hour and had nothing to show for it except numb fingers and the kind of exhaustion that made her bones ache. The cabin was another half-mile through snow that came up past her knees in the drifts. She kept her eyes on the trees ahead, counting steps, because that was all there was to do. 1 foot, then the other. Don't think about the empty shelf where the cornmeal used to be. Don't think about how long it had been since she'd had meat. She almost missed him. It was the horse that caught her attention first. A big roan gelding standing in a clearing just off the trail, reins dragging in the snow. The animal's head was low, and it was shaking, not from cold but from something worse. Mara stopped, her breath pluming in the air. "Easy," she said, though her voice came out rough. She hadn't used it in days. The horse didn't spook. It just stood there, and that was wrong. A loose horse should have bolted the second it saw her. She moved closer, slow, and that's when she saw the boot. It was sticking out from behind a fallen pine, half buried in a drift that had blown up against the trunk. Mara's stomach dropped. She pushed through the snow, her legs burning, and found him. A man, face down. One arm bent under his body, the other stretched out like he'd been reaching for something. His coat was dark with blood, and more of it had soaked into the snow beneath him in a wide, ugly stain that was already starting to freeze. Mara crouched beside him and pressed 2 fingers against his neck, just below the jaw. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, faint, unsteady, a pulse. "Damn it," she whispered. She should have walked away, should have taken the horse, and whatever supplies were in the saddlebags and left him there. He was a stranger, he was dying, and she had nothing to give, but her hands were already moving. She grabbed him under the arms and tried to roll him over. He was heavy, solid muscle under the layers of wool and leather, and it took her 3 tries to get him onto his back. His face was pale, lips blue, and there was a hole in his side just above the hip, ragged and still leaking blood. The bullet had gone clean through. She could see the exit wound in his back, but that didn't make it any less deadly. Mara sat back on her heels, breathing hard. Her mind was doing the math whether she wanted it to or not. He'd lost a lot of blood. Even if she got him warm, even if she could stop the bleeding, infection would probably kill him in a day or 2. And trying to save him meant using up the last of her firewood, the last of her whiskey, maybe the last of her strength. She looked at the horse again. It was watching her with dark, patient eyes. "Your owner's an idiot," she told it. "Getting himself shot out here in the middle of winter." The horse snorted. Mara swore under her breath, grabbed the man's wrists, and started dragging. It took her almost an hour to get him back to the cabin. By the time she kicked the door open and hauled him inside, her arms were shaking and her lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. She dropped him near the hearth, not gently, and bent double, trying to catch her breath. The horse had followed her the whole way, and now it stood just outside the door, snow piling up on its back. Mara led it around to the lean-to on the side of the cabin, stripped the saddle, and rubbed it down with an old rag. There wasn't much hay left, but she gave the animal what she could. It deserved that much. When she came back inside, the man still hadn't moved. Mara bolted the door and fed the last 3 logs into the fire. The flames caught quickly, throwing heat into the small room, and she knelt beside the stranger to get a better look. He was younger than she'd thought, maybe mid-30s, with a strong jaw and dark hair that was matted with sweat and snow. His clothes were good quality, the kind a man wore when he had money and didn't mind showing it. The coat was lined with fur, the boots were barely worn, and the gun belt around his waist had custom tooling in the leather. Whoever he wasn't some drifter. Mara unbuckled the belt and set it aside, then started working his coat off. The fabric was stiff with frozen blood, and she had to cut the shirt away with her knife. The wound was worse up close, an angry, puckered hole that was still oozing. She pressed a rag against it and felt him flinch, just barely. "Stay with me," she muttered, though she didn't know why she said it. She worked fast, boiled water in the kettle, poured whiskey over her hands and the wound, and used the last clean thread she had to sew him up. It wasn't pretty. Her stitches were uneven, her hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but it would hold. When she was done, she sat back and wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. The man's breathing was shallow, but it was there. That was something. Mara wrapped him in both of her blankets and then just sat there, staring at him. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind howled. "You'd better be worth it," she said quietly. The man didn't wake that night, or the next morning. Mara checked his wound twice, cleaned it once, and kept the fire going even though it meant burning a chair leg when the wood ran out. His fever spiked on the second day, and she spent hours pressing cold rags to his forehead, trying to bring it down. She didn't know his name, didn't know where he'd come from or why someone had shot him, but she knew what a bullet wound looked like when it came from an ambush. And she knew the kind of men who did that sort of thing didn't stop looking just because their target got away. On the third morning, his eyes opened. Mara was sitting by the fire, chewing on a piece of dried meat she'd found in the saddlebag, when she heard him move. She turned, and he was looking right at her. "Where am I?" His voice was rough, barely more than a rasp. "My cabin," Mara said, "about 15 miles south of Coldwater Pass." He tried to sit up, and she saw the moment the pain hit him. His face went white, and he sank back down, breathing hard. "Don't," she said. "You'll tear the stitches." He stared at the ceiling for a moment, then turned his head to look at her again. "How long?" 3 days. 3. He closed his eyes. "They'll have moved on by now." "Who?" "Doesn't matter." He shifted slightly, testing his range of motion, and winced. "You pull the bullet?" "Went clean through. You're lucky." "Don't feel lucky." Mara took another bite of the dried meat and watched him. He was studying the cabin now, the rough-hewn walls, the empty shelves, the way the wind rattled the shutters. His gaze came back to her, and she saw him take in her worn clothes, her too thin face, the way her hands were red and chapped from cold. "You live here alone?" he asked. "That's none of your business." "Fair enough." He was quiet for a moment. "You got a name?" "Mara." "Silas Vance." The name didn't mean anything to her, but the way he said it, like he expected it to, told her it probably should have. She didn't ask. "You should rest," she said instead. "Fever's not gone yet." "Can't. Need to get moving." "You can barely sit up." "Won't matter if I'm still here when they come back." Mara set the dried meat aside. "Who's they?" Silas looked at her for a long moment, like he was deciding how much to say. Finally, he sighed. "Harland Creed's men. He owns most of the valley north of here, and he's been trying to take the rest. Water rights, mostly. My ranch controls the main stream that feeds into 3 others, and he wants it." "So he shot you." "He had someone else do it. Creed doesn't get his hands dirty." Silas shifted again, and this time he managed to prop himself up on one elbow. "I was on my way to Coldwater to file a complaint with the territorial marshal when they hit me. 4 men, maybe 5. I got one of them before my horse bolted, but the rest—" He gestured at his side. "Didn't get far." Mara frowned. "If they're still looking for you, they'll check every cabin between here and the pass." "I know. Then you need to leave." "Not yet." He met her eyes, and there was something hard in his gaze, something that hadn't been there before. "I need a day, maybe 2, just until I can ride." "You won't make it 2 days." "I'll make it." Mara shook her head. She didn't owe this man anything, didn't owe him her firewood or her food or the risk that came with hiding him. But she'd already pulled him out of the snow, already stitched him up, and walking away now felt like letting go of a rope halfway through a climb. "Fine," she said. 2 days. Then you're gone." Silas nodded, and his head sank back down onto the blanket. "Thank you." Mara didn't answer. She just stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered trees. Somewhere out there, men were hunting, and she'd just put herself right in their path. The knock came that afternoon. Mara was outside, chopping wood from a fallen branch she'd dragged in from the tree line, when she heard the horses. She froze, the axe still raised, and listened. 2 riders, maybe 3, coming up the trail from the east. She dropped the axe and ran for the cabin. Silas was awake, sitting up with his back against the wall. He looked at her face and reached for his gun belt without a word. "Don't," Mara hissed. "If they see that, they'll know. If they come in here, then I'll handle it." She didn't wait for him to argue. She grabbed the blankets off him, shoved them into the corner, and kicked straw over the bloodstains on the floor. Silas moved slowly, painfully, into the shadows near the back wall, where the light from the window wouldn't reach. The knock came again, harder this time. Mara wiped her hands on her skirt, took a breath, and opened the door. Two men stood on the step. Both were armed, both looked cold and mean, and the taller one had a scar that ran from his eyebrow to his jaw. "Afternoon," he said, though his tone suggested it was anything but polite. "Can I help you?" Mara kept her voice flat, uninterested. "Maybe. We're looking for a man, hurt, probably bleeding. You seen anyone like that?" "No." The scarred man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You sure about that?" "I'm sure." He glanced past her, into the cabin, and Mara saw his gaze linger on the hearth, the shadows, the corner where Silas was hidden. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought he might hear it. "You live out here alone?" the man asked. "That's none of your business. It is if you're hiding someone." "I'm not." The second man, shorter, with a patchy beard, leaned in. "You mind if we take a look inside?" "Yes," Mara said. "I do." The scarred man's smile faded. "We're just trying to help, ma'am. Man we're looking for is dangerous, killed one of ours a few days back. If he's here, you're in danger." "I haven't seen anyone," Mara said again. "Now get off my step." The scarred man studied her for a long moment. Then he shrugged. "All right. But if you do see him, you let us know. We'll be around." He turned to leave and Mara started to close the door. And then he spun back and shoved it open, hard enough to send her stumbling backward. "Thought so," he said, stepping inside. Mara hit the floor, her shoulder slamming into the edge of the table, and the second man followed the first inside, his hand already on his gun. "Where is he?" the scarred man demanded. Mara didn't answer. She stayed on the floor, her mind racing, and then Silas stepped out of the shadows. "Right here," he said. Both men turned. Silas was pale, swaying slightly, but he had his revolver leveled at the scarred man's chest. "You should have kept riding," Silas said quietly. The scarred man's hand twitched toward his gun, and Silas pulled the hammer back with a sharp metallic click. "Don't." For a moment no one moved. Then the scarred man raised his hand slowly, and the second man did the same. "We're just doing a job, Vance," the scarred man said. "Creed's offering good money for you, dead or alive. Tell Creed he can go to hell. Tell him yourself. He'll be at your ranch by now, taking what's his." Silas's jaw tightened, and Mara saw his hand shake, just a little. He was running on fumes, and they all knew it. "Get out," Silas said. The scarred man smiled. "Sure, but we'll be back. And next time we won't knock." He turned and walked out, the second man following. Mara heard their boots crunching in the snow, heard them mount up and ride away. And then the cabin was silent, except for the sound of Silas breathing hard. He lowered the gun, took one step toward the door, and collapsed. Mara scrambled to her feet and caught him before he hit the floor. His wound had torn open again. She could feel the blood soaking through his shirt. And when she looked down, his face was gray. "Damn it," she whispered. "Damn it, Silas, I told you not to move." His eyes fluttered open, just for a second. "Had to." "Yeah, well, you're an idiot." She got him back to the blankets, tore his shirt open, and pressed a rag against the wound. The bleeding was bad, but not as bad as it could have been. She worked quickly, re-stitching what had torn, cleaning the blood away, and all the while her mind was racing. The men would be back. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And when they came, they wouldn't leave without Silas, or without burning the cabin to the ground. She looked at him, unconscious again, his breathing shallow. "We can't stay here," she said aloud, though he couldn't hear her. Outside, the wind picked up, and the first flakes of a new storm began to fall. Mara didn't sleep that night. She sat by the fire with Silas's revolver across her lap, listening to the wind and watching the door. Every creak of the cabin made her pulse jump. Every shift in the darkness outside the window felt like the prelude to boots on the step and fists pounding wood. But no one came. By By dawn, the storm had thickened into a full blizzard. Snow piled against the door in drifts that came halfway up the frame, and the wind screamed through gaps in the walls that Mara had never bothered to fill. She fed the fire with the last of the chair and part of an old crate, then checked Silas's wound. The bleeding had stopped, but the skin around the stitches was hot to the touch. Fever again. She soaked a rag in cold water from the bucket. Ice was already forming on the surface, and pressed it to his forehead. His eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharpening when he saw her face. "Still here," he said, his voice hoarse. "Still breathing," Mara replied. "Barely." He tried to sit up and she put a hand on his chest to stop him. "Don't. You tore half the stitches last night. I'm not doing it again. We need to move." "In this?" Mara gestured toward the window, where the world outside was nothing but white. "You wouldn't make it 50 feet. They'll come back. Not in a blizzard." She sat back on her heels. "No one's that stupid." Silas looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something flicker in his expression. Doubt, maybe, or the recognition that she was right. He let his head drop back onto the blanket. "How long?" he asked. "How long what? How long have you been out here alone?" Mara frowned. "Why does it matter?" "It doesn't. Just making conversation." "Don't." "Why not?" "Because I don't know you and you don't know me, and the second this storm clears, you're leaving." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Fair enough." But he kept watching her, and Mara hated that. Hated the way his gaze followed her when she moved to stoke the fire, when she checked the window, when she rationed out the last handful of cornmeal into a pot to make something that might pass for porridge. She wasn't used to being seen anymore. Out here, she'd gotten good at being invisible. 4 months? She said finally, not looking at him. "What? You asked how long? 4 months." She stirred the pot, watching the water start to simmer. "I came up here in September. Haven't seen another person since. That's a long time to be alone. It's safer." "Safer than what?" Mara didn't answer. She ladled the thin porridge into a bowl and brought it to him, crouching beside the blankets. He took it with hands that shook slightly, and she saw him wince when the movement pulled at his side. "You need to eat," she said. "So do you. I'll eat when you're done." He looked at the bowl, then at her, and she saw the question forming in his eyes. But he didn't ask it. He just ate, slow and careful, and when he was finished, he handed the bowl back. "Thank you," he said. Mara took the bowl and stood. "Don't thank me yet. You're still half dead." She ate what was left, barely 3 spoonfuls, and then went to the window to watch the storm. The snow was coming down so thick she couldn't see the tree line anymore. Just white, endless, and suffocating, and for the first time in weeks she felt the edges of panic creeping in. They were trapped. No food, no firewood, and 2 men who'd promised to come back, even if the storm bought them a day or 2. What then? Silas couldn't ride and she couldn't carry him, and if Creed's men didn't kill them, the cold would. "Mara." She turned. Silas was watching her again, his expression unreadable. "What?" she said. "You're thinking too loud." "I'm thinking we're in trouble." "I know." He shifted slightly, grimacing. "But we're not dead yet. Give it time." He almost smiled at that. Almost. Then his face went serious again, and he said, "When this clears, I'll get you out of here. I owe you that much." "You don't owe me anything." "I do." He paused. "You could have left me in the snow. You didn't. That counts for something." Mara looked at him, at the pale, stubborn set of his jaw, and felt something twist in her chest that she didn't want to name. She turned back to the window. "Just don't die on me," she said quietly. "I've already wasted too much thread on you." The storm lasted 2 days. On the first night, Mara burned the table. On the second, she tore up the floorboards near the back wall and fed them into the fire one by one. The cabin was falling apart around them, but it kept them alive. Silas's fever broke on the morning of the 3rd day. He woke clear-eyed for the first time since she'd found him, and when he sat up, slowly, carefully, he didn't collapse. "Better," Mara said, watching him from across the room. "Better," he agreed. He touched his side gingerly, feeling the edge of the bandage through his shirt. "You do good work." "I used to." "Used to?" Mara didn't answer. She stood and went to the door, brushing snow away from the frame so she could crack it open. The storm had passed, and the sky outside was a hard, brittle blue, the kind of cold that hurt to breathe. "We need to leave," she said. "Now? Before they come back?" She turned to look at him. "Can you ride?" Silas stood, using the wall for support, and took a few experimental steps. His face went tight with pain, but he stayed upright. "I can ride," he said. Mara didn't believe him, but she didn't argue. She packed what little they had, Silas's saddlebag, the blankets, his gun, and helped him into his coat. He moved like an old man, stiff and slow, and she saw him bite down on a grimace when he bent to pull on his boots. Outside, the horse was still in the lean-to, pawing at the frozen ground. Mara saddled it quickly, her fingers numb despite the gloves, and led it around to the front of the cabin. Silas was standing in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame. He looked at the horse, then at her. "You're coming with me," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." "Mara, I'll be fine." "No, you won't." His voice was firm now, not a request. "They know you helped me. They'll come back, and when they do, I'll handle it." "You'll die." Mara felt her jaw tighten. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she'd been handling herself just fine before he showed up. But the truth was sitting heavy in her chest, and she couldn't ignore it. He was right. Creed's men wouldn't forget her face, wouldn't forget that she'd lied to them, hidden Silas, cost them time. "Where would I even go?" she asked finally. "Red Hollow, my ranch." He took a step toward her, moving carefully. "It's 2 days' ride south. You'll be safe there." "You don't know that." "I do. My people are loyal, and Creed doesn't have the numbers to take the ranch head on. Not yet." He paused. "You saved my life. Let me return the favor." Mara looked at him, at the steadiness in his eyes, and felt the last of her resistance crack. She didn't want to go. Didn't want to trust him. Didn't want to leave the small, fragile safety of the cabin. But staying meant dying, and she'd fought too hard to survive just to give up now. "Fine," she said. "But if this gets me killed, I'm coming back to haunt you." Silas smiled, just barely. "Deal." They left the cabin behind without looking back. Mara climbed into the saddle first, and Silas pulled himself up behind her, his breath hissing through his teeth, when the movement jarred his wound. She felt his weight settle against her back, one arm wrapping around her waist to hold on. "Ready?" she asked. "No," he said. "But let's go anyway." She kicked the horse into a walk, and they headed south through snow that came up to the animal's knees. The first few hours passed in silence. The horse moved slowly, laboring through the drifts, and Mara kept her eyes on the trees, watching for movement. Silas's grip around her waist was tight at first, then gradually loosened as exhaustion caught up with him. She felt his head drop forward once, his forehead resting against her shoulder, and she didn't say anything. By midday, they reached the edge of the high country and started down into the valley. The snow was thinner here, the ground rocky and uneven, and Mara had to focus to keep the horse from stumbling. Behind her, Silas stirred. "How far?" he asked, his voice rough. "To Red Hollow? Still a day and a half, maybe more. We need to stop soon. Let the horse rest." Mara glanced at the sky. The sun was already sinking toward the western ridge, and the temperature was dropping fast. "There's a line shack about an hour from here. Old trapper's place. We can make it that far." Silas didn't argue. They found the shack just as the light started to fail. It was smaller than Mara's cabin, just one room with a stone hearth and a roof that sagged in the middle, but it was shelter. She dismounted first, then helped Silas down. He leaned heavily on her for a moment before finding his balance. "I'm fine," he said, though his face said otherwise. "Sure you are." Inside, the shack was cold and smelled like old smoke and rot, but the hearth was intact and there was a stack of dry wood in the corner. Mara got a fire going while Silas lowered himself onto the floor near the wall, moving like every muscle in his body hurt. "Let me see the wound," Mara said once the fire was burning steady. "It's fine." "Let me see it anyway." He sighed but didn't fight her. She knelt beside him and unbuttoned his shirt, peeling back the fabric to check the bandage. It was stained with fresh blood, but not much. The stitches were holding. "You're lucky," she said, retying the bandage. "So you keep saying—" "I mean it. Half an inch to the left and you'd have bled out before I even found you." Silas looked at her, and there was something in his expression that made her pause. "Why did you?" he asked. Why did I what? Find me. Pull me out of the snow. You didn't know me. Didn't owe me anything. So why? Mara sat back on her heels, her hand still on the edge of the bandage. It was a good question, one she'd been asking herself since the moment she'd seen his boot sticking out of the drift. I don't know, she said finally. Maybe I'm just stupid. You're not stupid. Then maybe I'm just tired of watching people die. The words came out sharper than she'd meant them to, and she saw Silas's expression shift. He didn't ask what she meant, didn't push. He just nodded, like he understood, and that was somehow worse. Mara stood and moved back to the fire, busying herself with feeding it another log. Behind her, she heard Silas shift, settling against the wall. You were a nurse, he said after a moment. Mara froze. What? The way you handled the wound, the stitches, you've done it before. She didn't turn around. A long time ago. What happened? Nothing that matters now. Mara, drop it, Silas. He went quiet, and Mara felt the silence stretch between them, heavy and uncomfortable. She wanted to leave it there, wanted to let the conversation die, but part of her, some small, stubborn part, wanted him to know, wanted someone to know. I worked at a hospital in Carson City, she said finally, still staring at the fire. 5 years. I was good at it, really good. And then one night, a man came in, rich family, important name. He'd been drinking, got into a fight, and someone put a knife in his gut. She paused, her hands curling into fists. I did everything right. Stopped the bleeding, stitched him up, kept him stable. But he had an infection I didn't catch in time, and he died 2 days later. She turned to look at Silas. His family blamed me, said I was negligent, said I killed him. They had money and lawyers, and I had nothing. So they destroyed me. Took my license, my reputation, everything. Silas's face was hard to read in the firelight, but his eyes never left hers. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Don't be. It was a long time ago. Doesn't make it right. Mara shrugged. Nothing about it was right, but I survived. That's more than some people get. She turned back to the fire, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, and Mara pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. For what it's worth, Silas said eventually, I'm glad you were there, in the snow. I'm glad it was you. Mara didn't answer. She didn't trust herself to. They stayed in the shack until dawn, then set out again as soon as there was enough light to see by. The terrain grew rougher as they descended into the valley, steep switchbacks and narrow trails that forced the horse to pick its way carefully. Silas was quiet for most of the ride, and Mara could feel the tension in his body, the way he held himself stiff to keep from jarring his wound. By mid-afternoon, they crested a ridge and Mara saw it. Red Hollow Ranch spread out in the valley below, a cluster of buildings surrounded by pastures and split-rail fences. Smoke rose from the main house, and she could see figures moving near the barn. There, Silas said, his voice rough with relief. But as they started down the slope, Mara saw something else. Horses tied to the porch rail. Too many horses. And men standing in the yard, armed and watchful. Silas, she said slowly, those your people? He didn't answer right away, then quietly, no. Mara's stomach dropped. Creed? Looks like it. She pulled the horse to a stop, her mind racing. They were still too far away to be seen clearly, but close enough that turning back would draw attention, and even if they ran, where would they go? Silas could barely stay upright, and the horse was exhausted. What do we do? She asked. Silas was silent for a moment, his hand tightening on her waist. Then he said, We ride in. Are you insane? Probably. He shifted slightly, and she felt him straighten behind her. But if Creed's already at the ranch, running won't help. We need to face this head on. Face what? 12 armed men? I've got 12 of my own. They're just outnumbered right now. He paused. Trust me, Mara wanted to argue. Wanted to turn the horse around and ride until they were back in the high country, back where the only thing trying to kill them was the cold. But she thought about the shack, the empty cabin, the long months of hiding, and something in her chest hardened. She was tired of running. Fine, she said, but if this gets us killed, I know, you'll haunt me. She kicked the horse forward, and they rode down into the valley. The men in the yard saw them coming. Mara watched as they turned, hands moving to their guns, and a tall man with graying hair stepped off the porch. He was older than the others, maybe 50, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from stone. Harland Creed. It had to be. Mara pulled the horse to a stop about 20 feet from the porch, and Silas dismounted, slowly, carefully, using her shoulder for balance. She stayed in the saddle, her hand resting on the reins, and watched the men watching them. Creed smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Silas Vance," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "Heard you were dead." "Heard wrong," Silas replied. "Shame." Creed's gaze shifted to Mara, lingering just long enough to make her skin crawl. "And who's this?" "None of your business." Creed's smile widened. "Fair enough. Though I have to say, I'm impressed. You took a bullet, disappeared into a blizzard, and still made it back. That takes guts." He gestured toward the ranch. "Unfortunately, you're a little late. I've already made myself at home." "This isn't your land, Harlan." "Isn't it?" Creed stepped closer, his hands clasped behind his back. "You've been gone 3 days, Vance. Your men didn't know if you were alive or dead, and I offered them a choice. Work for me or find new employment. Most of them chose the former." Silas's jaw tightened. "Where's Emmett?" "Your foreman? He's around, locked up actually. Couldn't quite convince him to see reason." Creed tilted his head. "You want him back? I'm willing to negotiate." "I'm not negotiating with you." "Then you're a fool." Creed's voice hardened. "This valley runs on water, and I control most of it. Your stream is the last piece I need, and I'm taking it. You can sell to me now, walk away with something, or I can wait until you bleed out from stubbornness and take it anyway." Silas took a step forward, and Mara saw him waver slightly. She dismounted quickly, moving to his side, and he steadied himself with a hand on her shoulder. "You're not taking anything," Silas said. Creed looked at him for a long moment, then laughed. "You can barely stand, Vance. What are you going to do, shoot me? You're outnumbered 10-1. "Doesn't matter." "Of course it does." Creed's expression shifted, the amusement fading. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign over the water rights to me, and in exchange I'll let you and your lady friend ride out of here alive. Refuse, and my men will put you in the ground right here in your own yard." Mara felt Silas tense beside her, felt the weight of his hand on her shoulder, and something snapped inside her. She stepped forward, putting herself between Silas and Creed, and looked the older man straight in the eye. "You're bluffing," she said. Creed raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. You're bluffing." Mara's voice was steady, sharper than she'd expected. "If you had the legal right to this land, you wouldn't be here with guns. You'd be in Coldwater with a judge and a marshal. But you're not, because you don't have the law on your side. You've got threats and hired guns, and that only works if people are too scared to call you on it." Creed's smile vanished. "Careful, girl. You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about." Mara took another step forward, her hands steady at her sides. "You want this ranch because you need the water, but water rights in this territory are tied to land grants and recorded claims. If Silas's claim is legitimate, and I'm guessing it is, you can't just take it, not legally. So you've been trying to scare him into selling, and when that didn't work, you tried to kill him." Creed's face darkened. "You've got a mouth on you, and you've got a problem." Mara gestured toward the men in the yard. "These men work for you because you pay them. But how long do you think that lasts if they realize you're breaking the law? If a marshal shows up and starts asking questions, you think they'll stand with you when it means a noose?" One of the men shifted uncomfortably, and Mara saw the crack, saw the doubt. Creed saw it too. His hand moved toward his gun, and Silas stepped forward, his own revolver already drawn. "Don't," Silas said quietly. For a long moment, no one moved. The yard was silent except for the wind and the creak of leather as the men around them tensed. Then Creed lowered his hand. "This isn't over," he said, his voice cold and flat. "No," Silas agreed. "It's not." Creed turned and walked back to his horse, his men following. They mounted up in silence, and Mara watched as they rode out of the yard and disappeared into the trees. When they were gone, Silas lowered his gun and looked at her. "That was reckless," he said. "That was necessary. He could have shot you." "He didn't." Silas shook his head, but there was something in his expression that looked almost like admiration. "You're either very brave or very stupid." "Probably both." A door slammed and Mara turned to see a man stumbling out of the barn, tall, broad-shouldered, with a bruise darkening his jaw. He stopped when he saw Silas, and his face broke into a grin. "Boss," he said, his voice rough, "thought you were dead." "Not yet, Emmett." Silas holstered his gun and started toward the barn, moving stiffly. "Get the men together. We've got work to do." Emmett nodded and jogged off, and Silas turned back to Mara. She was still standing in the yard, her heart pounding, and he walked over to her slowly. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For not letting me die. For coming here. For standing up to Creed when I couldn't." He paused. "For all of it." Mara looked at him, at the exhaustion in his face and the steadiness in his eyes, and felt something shift in her chest. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. "Hope. Don't thank me yet," she said. "He's coming back." "I know." Silas glanced toward the trees where Creed had disappeared. "But when he does, we'll be ready." Mara spent the first hour at Red Hollow trying to stay out of the way. The ranch came alive the moment Creed's men disappeared, workers emerging from the bunkhouse and barn, voices rising in heated conversation, Emmett barking orders as he organized sentries and checked weapons. It was controlled chaos, and she had no place in it. She ended up in the main house, standing in the kitchen while an older woman with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun handed her a cup of coffee. "You look half dead," the woman said bluntly. "When's the last time you ate?" "I don't remember," Mara admitted. The woman made a disapproving sound and turned to the stove, pulling a pot of stew off the heat. She ladled a generous portion into a bowl and set it on the table with a spoon. "Sit. Eat. Don't argue." Mara sat. The stew was thick with meat and vegetables, and the first bite made her realize just how hollow she'd been. She ate quickly, almost desperately, and the woman watched her with sharp eyes. "I'm Ruth," she said after a moment. "Been keeping house here for 15 years. You got a name?" "Mara." "Mara." Ruth nodded, like she was filing it away. "You're the one who pulled Silas out of the snow." It wasn't a question, but Mara answered anyway. "Yes. Then you've got more backbone than most." Ruth poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from Mara. "Emmett told me what you said to Creed in the yard. That was either brave or foolish." "I've been hearing that a lot today." Ruth smiled faintly. "Well, whichever it was, it bought us time. Creed's not used to being called out in front of his own men. He'll be angry, but he'll also be careful. That's something." Mara set down her spoon. "He's coming back, though. You know that." "Of course he is. Men like Harland Creed don't give up just because someone stands up to them. They dig in harder." Ruth's expression grew serious. "But Silas is tougher than he looks, and so are the people who work for him. We've been through worse." "Have you?" Ruth hesitated, then nodded. "Drought 3 years back. Lost half the herd, nearly lost the ranch. Silas could have sold then, had offers from buyers who would have paid good money. But he didn't. He held on, worked himself half to death, and kept every man on the payroll even when there was barely enough to go around. People remember that." Mara looked down at her bowl, at the steam still rising from the stew, and felt something twist in her chest. She'd spent so long alone, so long believing that people were only out for themselves, that hearing about Silas's loyalty felt almost foreign. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you need to know what kind of man you saved." Ruth stood and refilled Mara's coffee cup. "And because I think you might be the kind of person who'll stand with him when it matters." Before Mara could respond, the door opened and Silas stepped inside. He looked exhausted, pale and drawn, moving carefully to avoid pulling at his wound, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Ruth," he said, "can you get the maps from my office? The land grant documents, too. Everything we've got." Ruth nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Silas pulled out a chair and lowered himself into it with a grimace. "You should be resting," Mara said. "Can't. Too much to do." He looked at her, his gaze steady. "You holding up?" "Better than you." He smiled faintly at that. "Fair." Ruth returned with an armload of rolled maps and a leather folder stuffed with papers. She spread them out on the table, and Silas leaned forward, tracing his finger along the lines of ink. "This is Red Hollow. he said, tapping a section near the center. The main stream runs through here, splits into 3 tributaries that feed the lower valley. Creed controls everything west of the ridge, but he doesn't have access to the headwaters. That's what he wants. Mara studied the map. If he controls the lower valley, why does he need your water? Because the lower valley is drying up. He's been overgrazing for years, and the wells are starting to run shallow. Without access to the headwaters, he'll lose his cattle and his leverage over the other ranchers. Silas pulled a document from the folder and set it beside the map. This is the original land grant. My father got it 20 years ago, and it includes water rights to the entire stream system. It's legal, it's recorded, and Creed knows it. Then why hasn't he taken it to court? Mara asked. Because he'd lose. Silas leaned back in his chair. The law's on my side, and he knows it. So instead, he's been trying to force me out. Intimidation, sabotage, cutting off supply lines. When that didn't work, he tried to kill me. Ruth crossed her arms. And now he's here, sitting on your land like he owns it. Not for long, Silas said. His voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. I'm riding to Coldwater tomorrow. I'll file a formal complaint with the marshal and get an injunction to remove Creed from the property. Mara frowned. You can barely sit a horse. How are you going to make it to Coldwater? I'll manage. Silas, I don't have a choice, Mara. He met her eyes. If I don't act now, Creed will dig in deeper. He'll bring more men, fortify the ranch, and by the time the law gets involved, it'll be too late. Then send someone else. Emmett, or one of the other men. It has to be me. I'm the landowner. The marshal won't take it seriously unless I'm the one standing in front of him. Mara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was being reckless, but she saw the determination in his face and knew it wouldn't matter. He'd made up his mind. Fine, she said, but I'm coming with you. Silas blinked. What? You heard me. You're still half dead, and if Creed's men are watching the roads, you'll need someone to watch your back. Mara, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, but I'm doing it anyway. She stood, her hands flat on the table. You said you owed me. Well, I'm calling it in. You don't ride to Coldwater alone. Silas looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude. Finally, he nodded. All right, he said quietly. We leave at dawn. That night, Mara slept in a real bed for the first time in months. Ruth had given her a room on the second floor of the main house, small but clean, with a window that overlooked the valley. She lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and tried not to think about what tomorrow would bring. But her mind wouldn't stop. She kept seeing Creed's face, the cold smile, the way his hand had moved toward his gun. She kept hearing his voice. This isn't over. He was right. It wasn't. She must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing she knew, someone was knocking on the door. Mara sat up, disoriented, and saw a pale light filtering through the window. Dawn. Mara? It was Silas's voice, muffled through the wood. You awake? Yeah. She threw off the blankets and pulled on her boots. Give me a minute. When she came downstairs, Silas was waiting in the kitchen with 2 saddled horses tied to the porch rail outside. Ruth handed Mara a bundle wrapped in cloth, bread and dried meat, and gave her a look that was part warning, part encouragement. Keep him alive, Ruth said. I'll try. They rode out as the sun broke over the eastern ridge, turning the snow-covered fields gold. The air was cold and sharp, and Mara's breath steamed in front of her face. Silas rode beside her, silent and tense, and she could see the strain in the way he held himself. How's the wound? She asked after a while. Fine. Liar. He glanced at her, and the corner of his mouth twitched. It hurts, but I've had worse. When? Long time ago, before I took over the ranch. He shifted in the saddle. I worked as a hired hand for a few years after my father died. Took jobs wherever I could find them. One of them was breaking horses for a man down in the border country. Got kicked in the ribs so hard I couldn't breathe right for a month. Sounds like you've got a talent for getting hurt. Apparently. He paused. What about you? You ever been hurt like that? Mara thought about this hospital in Carson City, the lawsuit, the months afterward when she couldn't find work and couldn't afford to eat. Yeah, she said, but not the kind you can stitch up. Silas didn't push. They rode in silence for a while, the only sound the crunch of snow under the horses' hooves. The trail wound through a narrow canyon, the walls steep and covered in ice, and Mara kept her eyes on the rocks above, watching for movement. They were halfway through the canyon when she saw it. A flash of color, brown coat, gray hat, on the ridge to the left. She pulled her horse to a stop and held up a hand. "What?" Silas asked. "Someone's up there." Silas followed her gaze, his hand moving to his revolver. For a moment there was nothing. Then the figure moved again, closer to the edge, and Mara saw the glint of metal. "Rifle," she said quietly. Silas swore under his breath. "Creed's men." "How many?" "Don't know. Could be one, could be a dozen." He looked at the canyon ahead, then back the way they'd come. "We're sitting ducks here. If they start shooting—" "They won't," Mara said. "How do you know?" "Because if they wanted us dead, we'd already be dead." She kept her eyes on the ridge. "They're watching, probably reporting back to Creed." Silas's jaw tightened. "Then we keep moving, fast." They spurred the horses into a trot, and Mara felt her pulse hammering in her ears. The canyon seemed to stretch on forever, the walls pressing in on either side, and she half expected to hear the crack of a rifle at any second. But the shot never came. By the time they cleared the canyon and reached open ground, Mara's hands were shaking. She slowed her horse and glanced back, but the ridge was empty now. Whoever had been there was gone. "They're letting us go," Silas said, his voice tight. "Why?" "Because Creed wants to know what you're doing, where you're going." Mara looked at him. "He's playing a longer game. Then we need to get to Coldwater before he does." They rode hard for the rest of the morning, stopping only once to water the horses at a stream. By midday, the town came into view, a scattered collection of buildings straddling a frozen creek, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys. Coldwater wasn't much, but it had a marshal's office, and that was all they needed. They tied the horses outside a low building with a faded sign that read, "Territorial Marshal," and Silas pushed open the door. Inside, a man sat behind a desk, middle-aged and balding, with a badge pinned to his vest. He looked up when they entered, his expression neutral. "Help you?" he asked. "I need to file a complaint," Silas said, "and I need an injunction." The marshal set down his pen. "Against?" "Harland Creed. He's occupying my land illegally, and I want him removed." The marshal's face didn't change, but Mara saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or caution. "That's a serious accusation," the marshal said slowly. "It's the truth." Silas pulled the land grant documents from his coat and set them on the desk. "This is my deed. It's legal and recorded. Creed has no claim to Red Hollow, and he's there by force." The marshal picked up the papers and skimmed them, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he set them down. "I'll look into it," he said. "That's not good enough," Silas said. "I need you to come out to the ranch and remove him, now." "Can't do that." "Why not?" The marshal leaned back in his chair. "Because I don't have the authority to move against a man like Harland Creed without a court order, and the judge won't be back in town for another 2 weeks. Silas's hands curled into fists. 2 weeks? Creed could burn my ranch to the ground in 2 weeks. Maybe, but that's how the law works. The marshal's tone was flat, almost bored. "You want my advice? Sell to Creed. Take his money and move on. It'll save you a lot of trouble." Mara felt her temper flare. She stepped forward, putting herself between Silas and the desk. "You're telling him to roll over for a man who tried to have him killed?" The marshal's eyes shifted to her. "I'm telling him to be smart. Creed's got money, men, and connections. Fighting him is a losing game." "Then you're a coward," Mara said. The marshal's face darkened. "Watch your mouth, lady." "Or what? You'll arrest me?" Mara leaned on the desk. "You're supposed to uphold the law. That's your job. But instead you're sitting here telling a man to give up his land because you're too scared to do anything about it." The marshal stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't have to listen to this." "Yes, you do." Mara didn't back down. "Because if you don't act and something happens to Silas or his ranch, it's on you. And when the territorial governor hears about it, and he will, you'll be the one answering for it." The marshal stared at her, his jaw working. For a moment, Mara thought he might throw them out, but then he sat back down, slowly, and picked up his pen. "I'll send a deputy out to Red Hollow," he said, his voice tight. "He'll take a look, file a report. That's the best I can do." "When?" Silas asked. 3 days. Maybe 4. Silas's face was hard. That's not soon enough. It's all you're getting. The marshal went back to his paperwork, dismissing them. Now get out of my office. Silas looked like he wanted to argue, but Mara put a hand on his arm and shook her head. They walked out in silence, and the door slammed shut behind them. Outside, the cold hit like a slap. Silas stood on the step, his hands braced on the rail, and Mara saw the frustration etched into every line of his face. That was a waste, he said bitterly. No, it wasn't. Mara stepped beside him. We got him to agree to send someone. That's more than we had an hour ago. A deputy in 3 days won't stop Creed. No, but it gives us leverage. She looked at him. And it means we're not alone in this. Silas turned to face her, and for a moment she saw the weight he was carrying, the exhaustion, the anger, the fear he wouldn't admit to. Then he nodded, just barely. You're right, he said quietly. Thank you. For what? For not letting me give up. Mara felt something catch in her throat. She wanted to say it was nothing, that she was just doing what anyone would do, but the words wouldn't come. So she just nodded and turned toward the horses. They were halfway back to Red Hollow when the storm hit. It came on fast, the sky darkening in minutes, and the wind picked up until it was howling through the trees. Snow started to fall, thick, heavy flakes that stuck to everything, and within an hour, Mara could barely see 10 feet ahead. We need to find shelter, she shouted over the wind. Silas nodded, his face pale. He was hunched in the saddle, and Mara could see the pain in the set of his shoulders. The ride had been too much, and he was running on nothing but stubborn will. They found a cave just off the trail, shallow but deep enough to get the horses out of the wind. Mara dismounted and helped Silas down, and he leaned heavily on her as they stumbled inside. The cave was cold and damp, but it was better than being out in the storm. Mara tied the horses near the entrance and gathered what dry wood she could find, building a small fire that threw flickering shadows on the stone walls. Silas sat with his back against the wall, his eyes closed, and Mara knelt beside him to check his wound. The bandage was soaked through with blood, and when she peeled it back, she saw that the stitches had torn. Damn it, she muttered. Bad? Silas asked, his voice strained. Bad enough. She pulled thread and a needle from her pack. She'd taken them from Ruth before leaving, and set to work restitching the wound. Silas didn't make a sound, but she saw his jaw clench and his hands ball into fists. When she was done, she tied off the thread and sat back. You need to rest. No arguing. Wasn't going to. Mara wrapped him in a blanket and then sat beside the fire, staring into the flames. Outside, the storm raged, and she wondered if Creed's men were out there, watching, waiting. Mara, Silas said after a while. She turned. Yeah? Why'd you really come with me today? Mara hesitated. I told you, you needed someone to watch your back. That's not all of it. She looked at him, at the steadiness in his eyes, and felt the walls she'd built start to crack. No, she admitted. It's not. Then what? Mara took a breath. I spent 4 months hiding in that cabin because I thought it was safer to be alone. Thought if I didn't let anyone close, I couldn't get hurt again. But you know what I figured out? What? Being alone doesn't make you safe, it just makes you invisible. She paused. And I'm tired of being invisible. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're not invisible to me. Mara felt something break open in her chest, something she'd been holding on to for too long. She looked away, blinking hard, and tried to find her voice. I was a good nurse, she said finally. Before everything fell apart, I loved it. Loved helping people, loved knowing I could make a difference. And then they took it all away and I let them. I didn't fight. I just ran. You were protecting yourself. I was hiding. She turned back to him. But when I saw you in the snow, when I pulled you out and stitched you up, it felt like I was useful again. Like maybe I wasn't broken after all. Silas's expression softened. You're not broken, Mara. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. I don't feel strong. You are. He shifted slightly, wincing. You stood up to Creed when I couldn't. You called out that marshal when he tried to brush us off. You've kept me alive twice now. That's not nothing. Mara looked at him, at the honesty in his face, and felt the last of her resistance crumble. She didn't know what this was, this thing growing between them, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of it. "What happens when this is over?" she asked quietly. "What do you mean?" "When Creed's gone. When the ranch is safe. What happens to me?" Silas met her eyes. "That's up to you. But if you want, if you're willing, I'd like you to stay. At Red Hollow. With me." Mara's breath caught. "Why?" "Because I don't want you to disappear again." He paused. "And because I think we're better together than we are alone." Mara didn't answer right away. She just sat there, the fire crackling between them, and let herself think about what that would mean. A home, a place to belong, a future. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Silas smiled faintly. "That's all I'm asking." The storm lasted through the night. By morning, the sky was clear and the world outside the cave was blanketed in fresh snow. Mara woke stiff and cold, and when she looked over, Silas was still asleep, his breathing shallow but steady. She let him rest while she saddled the horses and stamped out the fire. When he finally woke, she helped him to his feet and they set out again, moving slowly through the snow. By mid-afternoon, Red Hollow came into view, but something was wrong. There was smoke rising from the yard, too much smoke, and as they got closer, Mara saw figures moving near the barn, heard the sharp crack of gunfire. Silas spurred his horse forward, and Mara followed, her heart pounding. Creed's men were back. And this time, they weren't leaving. They came in fast from the ridge, and Mara's first clear view of the yard made her stomach drop. The tool shed near the barn was burning, black smoke pouring into the sky, and men were scattered across the property, some crouched behind fence rails, others firing from the cover of the bunkhouse. She counted at least a dozen riders circling the perimeter, and more were pushing toward the stream that cut through the southern pasture. Silas pulled his horse to a stop at the tree line, his face grim. "They're going for the water." "What?" Mara shouted over the gunfire. "The headwaters. If they can control the stream, they can cut off the flow to the lower valley." He turned in the saddle, scanning the chaos. "Emmett's got men at the house, but they're pinned down. Creed's using the fire as a diversion." Mara's mind raced. The shed was already lost. Flames had consumed the roof and were licking up the walls, but if Creed's men reached the stream, they could dam it, redirect it, or worse. And with Silas's people spread thin trying to defend the buildings, there was no one left to stop them. "We need to split up," she said. Silas looked at her sharply. "No, you stay with me." "Silas, listen. I'm not letting you ride into that. You don't have a choice." Mara grabbed his arm, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You're barely staying upright. If you go down there alone, you'll get yourself killed. I can help." "Doing what?" "I can get to the stream before they do. I know what to look for. If they're trying to block the water, I can stop them, or at least slow them down." Silas's jaw tightened. "Mara, I'm not asking for permission." She let go of his arm and pulled her horse around. "You get to the house, rally your men, and hold the line. I'll handle the stream." Before he could argue, she kicked her horse forward and broke from the trees. The world exploded into noise and motion. Mara rode low in the saddle, her heart hammering as bullets whined past her. She cut across the open ground toward the southern pasture, weaving between fence posts and keeping her eyes on the line of riders ahead. They hadn't seen her yet. They were too focused on the stream, and she used that to her advantage. She reached the pasture fence and vaulted it, her horse clearing the rail in one smooth leap, and then she was racing across the snow toward the water. The stream was narrow here, maybe 10 feet across, but it ran fast and deep, cutting through a rocky bed that fed into the lower tributaries. If Creed's men dammed it, the entire valley would feel it within days. 3 riders were already dismounted near the bank, hauling logs and rocks from a pile they must have stacked earlier. Mara pulled her horse to a stop 30 feet away and swung down, her boots hitting the snow hard. She didn't have a gun, hadn't thought to grab one before leaving, but she had her voice, and right now that would have to be enough. "Stop!" she shouted. The men turned, startled. One of them, a young guy, maybe 20, with a patchy beard, reached for his rifle, but the older man beside him held up a hand. "Who the hell are you?" the older man asked. "Someone who's telling you to stop." Mara took a step closer, her hands steady at her sides. "You block this stream, you're breaking territorial water law. That's a federal offense." The older man laughed. Lady, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to turn around and ride out of here before you get hurt. I'm not going anywhere. Then you're stupider than you look. He gestured to the younger man. Get rid of her. The young guy hesitated, his hand still on the rifle. Boss said no killing unless we had to. I don't care what he said. Move her. The young guy stepped forward, and Mara saw the uncertainty in his face. He didn't want to do this. She could see it in the way his eyes kept flicking to the older man, like he was looking for a way out. You don't have to do this, Mara said, keeping her voice calm. Whatever Creed's paying you, it's not worth a noose. Shut up, the older man snapped, but the young guy stopped. She's got a point, Cal. If the law gets involved, the law's not getting involved. Creed's got the marshal in his pocket. Does he? Mara cut in. Because we were just in Coldwater and the marshal agreed to send a deputy out here. He'll be here in 3 days, maybe less. And when he shows up and sees what you've done, damming a stream, burning buildings, shooting at people, you think Creed's going to protect you? Or do you think he's going to let you hang while he walks away clean? The young guy's face went pale. He looked at Cal, then back at Mara, and she saw the crack widening. Cal saw it too. His hand moved to his gun. I said, shut up. Make me, Mara said. Cal's face twisted, and he drew his revolver. But before he could level it, a shot rang out from behind Mara, and Cal staggered backward, clutching his shoulder. The gun fell from his hand, and he dropped to his knees, cursing. Mara spun around. Silas was there, 20 feet away, his revolver still raised. His face was pale and slick with sweat, and he was leaning heavily on his horse, but his aim was steady. Next one goes through your chest, Silas said, his voice flat. Cal glared at him, blood seeping through his fingers. You're a dead man, Vance. Maybe, but not today. Silas shifted his gaze to the young guy. You, drop the rifle. The young guy hesitated, then let the weapon fall into the snow. He raised his hand slowly, his eyes wide. Smart, Silas said. He looked at the third man who'd been standing frozen near the logs. You too, hands up. The third man complied, and Silas gestured toward the horses. Mount up, all 3 of you, and ride back to Creed. Tell him if he wants this stream, he can come take it himself. Cal struggled to his feet, cradling his wounded shoulder. You just signed your death warrant. Wouldn't be the first time. Silas's voice was cold. Now get out of here before I change my mind. The 3 men climbed onto their horses and rode off, Cal swaying in the saddle, and Mara watched them disappear over the ridge before turning back to Silas. I told you to stay at the house, she said, and I told you not to ride into this alone. He holstered his gun and dismounted, moving stiffly. Guess we're both bad at following orders. Mara couldn't help it. She laughed, short and sharp, and some of the tension in her chest eased. You're an idiot. So are you. They stood there for a moment, the sound of gunfire still echoing from the main yard, and then Silas's face went serious again. We need to get back, he said. Emmett's holding the house, but he can't do it forever. Mara nodded. She helped Silas back onto his horse, and they rode toward the main yard together, cutting through the pasture and skirting the edge of the burning shed. The heat from the fire was intense, even from a distance, and Mara could see the timbers starting to collapse inward. When they reached the house, Emmett was crouched behind the porch rail with 3 other men, firing at a group of riders near the barn. He looked up when Silas and Mara dismounted, and relief flashed across his face. Boss, he said, his voice tight. Thought you were dead. Not yet. Silas dropped down beside him, grimacing as the movement pulled at his wound. What's the situation? They hit us about an hour ago. Set the shed on fire, then came at us from 3 sides. We've been holding them off, but we're running low on ammunition. Emmett reloaded his rifle, his hands moving fast. They're trying to wear us down. How many? 15, maybe 20. Hard to tell with all the smoke. Silas swore under his breath. Where's Ruth? Inside with the others. She's safe. Mara crouched beside them, her eyes scanning the yard. The riders near the barn were keeping their distance now, firing sporadically, but not pushing forward. It was like they were waiting for something. They're stalling, she said. Silas looked at her. What? They're not trying to take the house. They're just keeping you pinned down. She pointed toward the barn. Look, they're not advancing. They're just making noise. Emmett frowned. Why? Because Creed's not here. Mara's mind was racing, piecing it together. He sent these men to soften you up, to make you waste ammunition and energy. He's probably waiting for you to exhaust your defenses before he shows up with the rest of his people. Silas's face darkened. Then we need to end this before he gets here. How? Emmett asked. Silas looked at the burning shed, then at the riders near the barn, and Mara saw the gears turning in his head. We make them think we're weaker than we are. Draw them in close, then hit them hard. That's risky, Emmett said. Everything about this is risky. Silas turned to Mara. Can you shoot? Mara hesitated. I haven't held a gun in years. That's not what I asked. She met his eyes. Yeah, I can shoot. Silas handed her his revolver. Good. You're with me. He outlined the plan quickly. Emmett and 2 of the men would stay at the house, keeping up steady fire to hold the riders' attention. Silas and Mara would circle around through the bunkhouse and come at them from the side, cutting off their escape route. It wasn't elegant and it wasn't safe, but it was better than sitting there waiting to be picked off. You ready? Silas asked, looking at Mara. She checked the revolver's chamber, fully loaded, and nodded. Ready? They moved fast, staying low and using the smoke from the shed as cover. Mara's pulse was pounding in her ears, and her hands were slick with sweat despite the cold. She'd never been in a fight like this, never fired a gun at another person, and the weight of what she was about to do settled heavy in her chest. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. They reached the bunkhouse and pressed their backs against the wall, catching their breath. Silas looked at her, his face pale but determined. When we move, he said quietly, stay behind me. And if shooting starts, don't hesitate. Hesitation gets you killed. Mara nodded, her throat tight. Silas counted to 3, then stepped around the corner. The riders saw them immediately. One of them shouted, and the others turned, bringing their rifles up, but Silas fired first. The shot caught one of the men in the leg, and he went down hard, screaming. The others scattered, diving for cover behind the barn wall, and Mara raised the revolver with shaking hands. She aimed at the nearest rider, a man with a scar across his cheek, and pulled the trigger. The recoil jolted her arm and the shot went wide, kicking up snow a foot to the left of the man's boot. He turned, saw her, and brought his rifle around, and Mara's heart stopped. Then Silas fired again, and the man crumpled. Move! Silas shouted. Mara ran, following him as he advanced on the barn. The riders were breaking now, mounting their horses and retreating toward the ridge, and Emmett's men were pouring fire into their backs. 2 more went down before the rest disappeared over the rise, and then the yard went quiet. Mara stopped, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and looked at the revolver in her hand. It felt heavier now, like it had taken something from her. Silas touched her shoulder. You all right? She nodded, not trusting her voice. You did good, he said quietly. Mara didn't feel good. She felt hollow. But she didn't say that. She just handed him the revolver and walked back toward the house. The shed was still burning, the flames casting long shadows across the yard. Emmett and his men were checking the wounded. 3 of Creed's riders had been left behind, 1 dead, 2 barely hanging on. And Ruth came out of the house with bandages and water. When she saw Mara, she stopped. You hurt? No, Mara said. Ruth studied her for a moment, then nodded. Good. Come inside. I'll get you something to eat. Mara followed her into the house, her legs shaking, and sank into a chair at the kitchen table. Ruth poured her a cup of coffee and set it down without a word. Thank you, Mara said quietly. Ruth just nodded and went back to gathering supplies. Silas came in a few minutes later, moving stiffly. He sat down across from Mara, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. How bad is it? Mara asked finally. Could be worse. Silas rubbed his face. We lost the shed, but the house and barn are intact. No one on our side got killed, though we've got a few injuries. Emmett's seen to them now. And the stream? Still flowing. You stopped them in time. Mara wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers. They'll come back. I know. Silas's voice was heavy. Creed's not done. Not by a long shot. When? Soon. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, but soon. He looked at her, his eyes tired. You should leave, Mara. Get out while you still can. Mara stared at him. What? This isn't your fight. You don't owe me anything, and staying here— Stop! Mara set the cup down hard. I'm not leaving. Mara, I said I'm not leaving. She leaned forward, her voice firm. I stayed because I chose to. I fought because I chose to. And I'm not running now just because it's getting harder. Silas opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude. All right, he said quietly. Then we do this together. Together, Mara agreed. They sat there in silence, the weight of what was coming settling over them like a shadow. Outside, the sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Somewhere out there, Creed was gathering his forces. And when he came, it would be with everything he had. The attack came at dawn. Mara woke to the sound of shouting and gunfire, and she was on her feet before she was fully awake, her heart pounding. She grabbed her coat and boots and ran downstairs, nearly colliding with Ruth in the hallway. They're at the gate, Ruth said, her face tight. At least 30 of them. Mara swore and pushed past her, bursting out onto the porch. The yard was chaos. Men running for cover, horses screaming, bullets tearing through the fence rails. And at the front of it all, sitting tall in the saddle, was Harland Creed. He was flanked by a dozen riders, all armed, and more were pouring in behind him. Mara saw the scarred man from the cabin, saw the young guy who'd hesitated at the stream, saw faces she didn't recognize. Too many. Far too many. Silas was already at the porch rail, rifle in hand, and Emmett was beside him. They were firing, picking off riders as they advanced, but it wasn't enough. Creed's men just kept coming. Fall back to the house, Silas shouted. Everyone inside! The men retreated, dragging wounded with them, and Mara helped pull one of them, a kid, maybe 18, with a bullet in his shoulder, through the door. Ruth was already setting up a makeshift infirmary in the parlor, and Mara laid the kid down on the floor, pressing a rag against his wound. Stay with me, she said, her voice steady. You're going to be fine. The kid nodded, his face pale, and Mara turned to Ruth. I need bandages and whiskey. Ruth handed them over, and Mara worked quickly, cleaning the wound and wrapping it tight. The kid hissed in pain but didn't cry out, and when she was done, she squeezed his hand. You did good, she said. He managed a weak smile. Outside, the gunfire was relentless. Mara left the kid with Ruth and ran back to the porch, where Silas was reloading his rifle. His face was grim, and blood was seeping through his shirt again. You're bleeding, Mara said. I know. He didn't look at her. Can't stop now. Mara grabbed a rifle from the rack near the door and took up a position beside him. She'd never been much of a shot, but she didn't need to be perfect. She just needed to keep them back. She fired, and one of Creed's men went down. Fired again, and another stumbled. The recoil jarred her shoulder, and her ears rang with the noise, but she kept going. Creed's men pushed closer, and Mara saw them setting up near the barn, using it as cover. One of them lit a torch, and her stomach dropped. They're going to burn us out, she said. Silas saw it too. Emmett, take 3 men and get to the barn. Don't let them light that fire. Emmett nodded and ran, taking 2 men with him. They made it halfway across the yard before the gunfire drove them back, and one of the men fell, clutching his leg. Damn it, Silas muttered. He looked at Mara. Stay here. Keep firing. Where are you going? To stop them. Before she could argue, he was gone, vaulting over the porch rail and running toward the barn. Mara's heart lurched, and she fired again, trying to cover him, but there were too many targets and not enough bullets. Silas reached the barn and tackled the man with the torch, driving him into the ground. The torch flew from his hand, landing in the snow, and Silas grabbed it, stamping it out. But 3 more of Creed's men were on him, and Mara watched in horror as they dragged him to his feet and threw him against the barn wall. She didn't think, she just ran. She hit the yard at a dead sprint, the rifle still in her hands, and fired at the closest man. He went down, and the other 2 turned, startled. One of them raised his gun, and Mara swung the rifle like a club, catching him in the jaw. He dropped, and the 3rd man lunged at her. They hit the ground hard, and Mara lost her grip on the rifle. The man's hands closed around her throat, squeezing, and she clawed at his face, gasping for air. Her vision started to blur, black spots dancing at the edges, and she thought, this is it. Then the pressure released. The man was yanked off her, and Mara rolled onto her side, coughing and gasping. Silas was there, blood streaming from a cut above his eye, and he had the man by the collar. "Get out of here," Silas growled, shoving him toward the gate. "And don't come back." The man scrambled to his feet and ran, and Silas dropped to his knees beside Mara. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough. Mara nodded, still coughing. "Yeah, I think so." He helped her to her feet, and they stood there for a moment, surrounded by chaos, and Mara saw something in his face that made her chest ache. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't," Mara said. "Just don't." A gunshot cracked, and they both ducked. Creed's men were regrouping near the gate, and Mara saw Creed himself dismount, walking toward them with slow, deliberate steps. "Enough!" Creed shouted. "Everyone hold your fire!" The shooting stopped. The yard went quiet, and Creed stood in the center of it, his hands at his sides. "Silas Vance," he called. "Let's talk." Silas stepped forward, and Mara moved with him. Creed's eyes flicked to her, and he smiled faintly. "Still here, I see," he said. "You've got more fight in you than I thought." "What do you want, Harland?" Silas asked. "What I've always wanted. Your land. Your water." Creed spread his hands. "This can end right now. Sign over the deed and I'll walk away. No more bloodshed." "And if I don't?" Creed's smile faded. "Then I burn this place to the ground and take it anyway." Silas's hand moved to his gun, but Mara grabbed his arm. "Wait." She stepped forward, putting herself between Silas and Creed, and looked the older man in the eye. "You're not going to win this," she said. Creed laughed. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, I've already won." "No, you haven't." Mara's voice was steady. "You've got numbers, and you've got guns, but you don't have the law. The marshal's sending a deputy in 2 days, and when he gets here, he's going to see all of this. The burned buildings, the wounded men, the bodies, and he's going to ask questions. The marshal's in my pocket. Maybe. But the territorial governor isn't, and when Silas files a complaint with him, which he will, you're going to have a lot more to answer for than a water dispute." Creed's smile didn't waver, but Mara saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "You're bluffing," he said. "Am I?" Mara crossed her arms. "Because I don't think you'd be here if you thought you could take this through the courts. You're here because you're desperate, and desperate men make mistakes." Creed stared at her, his jaw working, and for a moment Mara thought he might pull his gun and end it right there. Then he turned and walked back to his horse. "This isn't over," he said, swinging into the saddle. "I'll be back. And next time, I won't be so generous." He rode out, his men following, and the yard fell silent. Mara's legs gave out, and she sank to the ground, her hands shaking. Silas dropped down beside her, and for a long moment they just sat there, breathing hard. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did it," Mara corrected. He looked at her, and she saw the exhaustion in his face, the pain, the gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "You would have figured it out." "Maybe, but I'm glad I didn't have to." They sat there in the snow, the sun rising over the ridge, and for the first time in days, Mara let herself believe they might actually survive this. The quiet didn't last. Mara helped Silas to his feet, and they walked back to the house together, his weight heavy on her shoulder. Blood was soaking through his shirt again, and his face had gone the color of old paper. Ruth met them at the door, took one look at Silas, and pointed toward the parlor. "Sit," she said, her tone brooking no argument. Silas didn't fight her. He sank into the chair by the window, and Mara knelt beside him to peel back his shirt. The wound had torn open completely this time, stitches shredded, skin ragged and inflamed. She pressed a clean rag against it to slow the bleeding, and Silas hissed through his teeth. "You need a real doctor," Mara said. "Closest one's in Coldwater. That's a day's ride." "Then we get you to Coldwater." "Can't. Not yet." He met her eyes. Creed meant what he said. He'll be back, and when he comes, it'll be with everything he's got. If I leave now, the ranch falls. Mara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was being stubborn and reckless, but she saw the steel in his gaze and knew it wouldn't matter. So she just nodded and set to work restitching the wound, her hand steadier than she felt. When she was done, Ruth brought them coffee and bread, and they sat in silence while the house settled around them. Outside, Emmett was organizing the men, posting sentries, checking ammunition, dragging the bodies of Creed's fallen riders to the edge of the property. The yard looked like a battlefield, scorched and trampled, and the smell of smoke hung heavy in the air. Mara stared out the window, her mind turning over everything that had happened. They'd survived the attack, but just barely, and Creed wasn't the type to give up after one loss. He'd regroup, bring more men, and come at them harder. The question wasn't if he'd return, it was when. "We need a plan," she said quietly. Silas nodded. "I know." "What's our best move?" He was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on his side. "We hold. We fortify the house and the barn, set up defensive positions, and we hold until the deputy gets here." "That's 2 days? Can we last that long?" "We'll have to." Mara frowned. "And if Creed doesn't wait 2 days? If he comes tonight? Then we fight." Silas's voice was flat, resigned. "And we hope we're still standing when the sun comes up." Mara looked at him, at the exhaustion etched into every line of his face, and felt a knot tighten in her chest. He was running on fumes, held together by willpower and Ruth's stitching, and she knew he wouldn't last another full assault. None of them would. "There has to be another way," she said. "If there is, I don't see it." Mara stood and paced to the window, staring out at the yard. Her mind was racing, turning over strategies and possibilities, and then something clicked. She turned back to Silas. "What if we don't wait for him to come to us?" she said. Silas frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if we go on the offensive, hit him before he's ready?" "Mara, we don't have the numbers." "We don't need numbers, we need leverage." She crossed the room and sat down across from him. "Creed's not here because he's confident. He's here because he's desperate. He needs your water, and he needs it now. If we can take that desperation and turn it against him, how?" Mara thought for a moment. "The land grant, the legal documents. If we can get those to the territorial governor before Creed can cover his tracks, we can force his hand. He'll have to back off or face federal charges." Silas shook his head. "The governor's office is in Helena. That's 3 days' hard ride, maybe more in winter. And even if we got there, there's no guarantee he'd act fast enough." "Then we don't go to Helena. We go to Coldwater and send a telegram." Silas's eyes sharpened. "The telegraph office." "Exactly. We send a message to the governor's office, lay out what's happening here, and copy the marshal. Once it's on record, Creed can't just bury it. He'll have to answer for what he's done." Silas leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "It could work, but someone would have to get to Coldwater, and with Creed's men watching the roads—" "I'll go," Mara said. "No." "Silas, I said no." His voice was firm. "It's too dangerous. If they catch you, they won't." Mara met his eyes. "I'm small, I'm fast, and I know how to stay out of sight. I can make it. You're also the only reason I'm still alive. I'm not sending you out there alone." "You don't have a choice." Mara leaned forward. "You can't ride, not like this, and Emmett needs to stay here to hold the ranch." "That leaves me." Silas stared at her, his jaw tight, and she saw the war playing out behind his eyes. He didn't want to let her go, didn't want to risk her, but he also knew she was right. "If something happens to you," he started. "It won't. You don't know that." "No," Mara admitted, "but I'm going anyway." Silas closed his eyes and let out a long breath. When he opened them again, there was resignation in his face. "When?" "Now, before Creed has time to set up roadblocks. You'll need a horse. Supplies. I'll take the roan. He's fast and he knows the trails." Silas nodded slowly. "All right, but you take my rifle, and if you see any of Creed's men, you don't engage. You run." "I will." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the land grant. He handed it to her, and their fingers brushed. "Don't lose this." "I won't." They stood, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. Mara wanted to say something, wanted to tell him she'd be back, that this wasn't goodbye, but the words stuck in her throat. Silas stepped closer and put a hand on her shoulder. "Be careful." "You too." She turned and walked out before he could say anything else. The ride to Coldwater was the longest 6 hours of Mara's life. She kept the roan at a steady pace, sticking to the back trails and avoiding the main road. Twice she saw riders in the distance and had to take cover, her heart pounding as she waited for them to pass. But they never saw her, and she made it to the outskirts of town just as the sun was starting to set. Coldwater looked different in the fading light, quieter, almost deserted. Mara tied the roan behind the telegraph office and slipped inside, the bell above the door jangling softly. The clerk behind the counter was an older man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He looked up when she entered, his expression neutral. "Help you?" he asked. "I need to send a telegram to the territorial governor's office in Helena." The clerk pulled out a form and a pencil. "Go ahead." Mara dictated the message carefully, laying out the facts in clear, precise language. Harland Creed's illegal occupation of Red Hollow Ranch, the attacks on Silas Vance and his people, the attempt to seize water rights through force and intimidation. She kept it short, kept it factual, and when she was done, she asked the clerk to send a copy to the marshal's office as well. The clerk read it over, his eyebrows rising slightly. "This is serious stuff." "I know. You sure you want to send this? Once it's on the wire, there's no taking it back." "I'm sure." The clerk nodded and started tapping out the message on the telegraph key. Mara watched the clicks and pauses, each one carrying her words across the miles, and felt a strange sense of relief. It was done. The truth was out there now, and Creed couldn't bury it. When the clerk finished, he handed her a receipt. "It'll reach Helena by morning. They'll have to respond within 48 hours per territorial law." "Thank you," Mara said. She paid him, tucked the receipt into her coat, and turned to leave. But as she reached the door, the clerk called out, "Ma'am?" She turned. "Yes? Good luck?" Mara nodded and stepped out into the cold. The ride back to Red Hollow was faster, adrenaline pushing her harder than caution. She made it past the ridge just as full dark settled in, and the ranch came into view, a cluster of lights in the distance, warm and steady. But as she got closer, she saw something that made her stomach drop. More riders. At least 20 of them gathered near the gate. And at the front, sitting tall in the saddle, was Harland Creed. Mara pulled the roan to a stop and dismounted, her legs shaking. She couldn't ride in, not with that many men between her and the house. She'd have to go on foot, use the darkness and the terrain to get close. She tied the roan to a tree and started moving, keeping low and using the fence line for cover. The voices from the yard carried on the night air, and she caught fragments of conversation. Creed's voice, smooth and cold, and Silas's, rough but steady. She crept closer until she could see them clearly. Creed was standing in the middle of the yard, his men fanned out behind him, and Silas was on the porch with Emmett and a handful of others. The tension was thick enough to cut. "I'm done playing games, Vance," Creed was saying. "You've got one last chance to walk away from this. Sign over the deed, and I'll let you and your people leave. Refuse, and I'll take it by force." "You're not taking anything," Silas said. Creed smiled. "We'll see about that." He turned and gestured to his men, and Mara saw them start to move, spreading out, surrounding the house. This was it. The final push. And if she didn't do something, they'd be overrun. She didn't think. She just acted. Mara stepped out of the shadows and into the yard, her hands raised. "Stop!" Every head turned. Creed's smile faded, and Silas's face went pale. "What the hell are you doing?" Silas shouted. Mara ignored him. She walked straight toward Creed, her heart hammering, and stopped 10 feet away. "It's over, Harlan," she said. Creed's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "I just sent a telegram to the territorial governor's office. Every detail of what you've done here, the attacks, the intimidation, the illegal seizure of land, it's all on record now, and they're sending federal marshals to investigate." Creed's face darkened. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Mara pulled the receipt from her coat and held it up. "This is proof. The message went out 2 hours ago. By morning, every lawman in the territory is going to know what you've done." Creed stared at the receipt, and Mara saw the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing his options, trying to decide if she was telling the truth. "Even if that's real," he said slowly, "it doesn't change anything. I've got 30 men here, and you've got, 10? I can take this ranch right now, and by the time the marshals show up, it'll be too late." "You could," Mara agreed, "but then you'd be admitting guilt. You'd be proving everything I said in that telegram. And when the marshals come, they won't just investigate. They'll arrest you for murder, arson, theft, and about a dozen other federal crimes." Creed's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about. And so do you." Mara stepped closer. "You've been trying to scare Silas into giving up because you knew you couldn't win legally. But now the law's involved, and there's no way out. You can walk away now, or you can dig yourself deeper. Your choice. Creed stared at her, his hand hovering near his gun, and the yard went silent. Mara's pulse was pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it, but she didn't move, didn't blink. Finally, Creed lowered his hand. "This isn't over," he said, his voice cold. "Yes, it is," Mara replied. Creed turned and walked back to his horse. He mounted up, his men following, and they rode out without another word. Mara stood there, watching them disappear into the darkness, and then her legs gave out. She sank to the ground, her whole body shaking, and Silas was there, kneeling beside her. "Are you insane?" he demanded, but his voice was shaking too. "Probably," Mara said. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, and she felt the tremor running through him. "Don't ever do that again." "I won't." They stayed like that for a long moment, and then Emmett's voice broke the silence. "Boss," he said quietly, "they're really gone." Silas stood, pulling Mara up with him, and looked at the empty yard. "Yeah, they are." The federal marshals arrived 3 days later. 2 of them, grim-faced and efficient, with a warrant for Harland Creed's arrest. They found him at his ranch, surrounded by his men, and took him into custody without a shot fired. The water rights were returned to Red Hollow, the land dispute was settled in Silas's favor, and Creed was charged with a list of crimes that would keep him behind bars for years. Mara watched it all unfold from the porch of the main house, Ruth beside her with a cup of coffee in hand. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" Ruth said, "after everything." "What does?" "Winning." Mara smiled faintly. "Yeah, it does." The weeks that followed were a blur of rebuilding. The burned shed was torn down and replaced, the fence rails were repaired, and the bullet holes in the barn wall were patched over. Slowly, the ranch started to look like itself again. Not perfect, but whole. Mara threw herself into the work. She helped Ruth in the kitchen, tended to the injured men who were still recovering, and spent long hours in the makeshift infirmary she'd set up in the parlor. It felt good to be useful again, to use her skills for something other than survival. One afternoon, she was checking on the young kid with the shoulder wound when Silas found her. "How's he doing?" Silas asked. "Better." "The infection's clearing up." Mara finished wrapping the bandage and stood. "He'll be back to full strength in a few weeks." Silas nodded. "Good." He paused. "Can I talk to you?" "Outside?" Mara followed him out to the porch, and they stood there in the cold, looking out at the valley. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and the air smelled like snow. "I've been thinking," Silas said after a moment. "About what?" "About you, and what happens next." Mara's chest tightened. "Silas, let me finish." He turned to face her. "You saved my life. More than once. You saved this ranch, and everyone on it. And I know you didn't have to do any of that. You could have walked away at any point, and no one would have blamed you." "I didn't want to walk away," Mara said quietly. "I know, and that's what I've been thinking about." He took a breath. "I asked you once if you'd stay, if you'd build a future here with me, and you said you'd think about it." Mara nodded, her throat tight. "Well, I'm asking again," Silas said. "Not because I need you to, though I do, but because I want you to, because I can't imagine this place without you in it." Mara looked at him, at the honesty in his face, and felt the last of her walls crumble. She'd spent so long running, so long hiding, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be wanted, to belong. "What would I even do here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever you want." Silas stepped closer. "You could keep helping Ruth. You could set up a real infirmary. Half the ranches in this valley don't have access to a nurse, and you're the best I've ever seen. Or you could just stay. Be part of this. Be part of us." Mara felt tears prick at her eyes, and she blinked them back. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." "You don't have to be ready. You just have to be willing." She looked out at this valley, at the ranch spread out before her, and thought about the months she'd spent alone in the cabin. Thought about the fear, the cold, the crushing weight of isolation. And then she thought about the past few weeks, the chaos and the danger, yes, but also the moments of connection, the feeling of being needed, of mattering. She turned back to Silas. "What if I mess it up?" "Then we'll figure it out together." Mara smiled, shaky but real. "You make it sound simple. It's not." But it's worth trying. She took a breath and nodded. All right, I'll stay. Silas's face broke into a grin and he pulled her into a hug. Mara let herself lean into him, let herself feel the warmth and the safety, and for the first time in years she felt like she was home. The months that followed weren't easy. There were hard days, long nights, and more than a few arguments. Mara struggled with the fear that she wasn't good enough, that she'd disappoint the people who were counting on her. And Silas struggled with the scars Creed had left behind, the distrust, the hypervigilance, the nightmares that woke him in the middle of the night. But they worked through it, together. Mara set up the infirmary in one of the outbuildings, and within weeks, people from neighboring ranches were showing up with injuries and illnesses. She treated broken bones and fevers, delivered babies and stitched wounds, and slowly her reputation spread. The woman who'd lost everything and rebuilt herself became the woman the valley turned to when things went wrong. Silas healed too, though it took longer. His wound left a scar that would never fully fade, and there were days when the pain was bad enough that he couldn't work. But he learned to accept help, learned to lean on the people around him, and little by little, the weight he'd been carrying started to lift. One evening, about 6 months after Creed's arrest, Mara and Silas were sitting on the porch, watching the sun go down. The valley was green now, the stream running clear and strong, and the ranch was thriving. "You ever think about the cabin?" Silas asked. Mara shook her head. "Not much. Why?" "Just curious. You spent a long time up there. Must have been hard to leave it behind." "It was," Mara admitted, "but it was harder to stay." Silas nodded, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then he said, "You know, I never thanked you." "For what?" "For not giving up on me. For not giving up on this place." Mara looked at him, and she saw the gratitude in his eyes, the quiet strength that had drawn her to him in the first place. "You didn't give up on me either." "No," Silas agreed. "I didn't." He reached over and took her hand, and Mara laced her fingers through his. They sat there together, watching the light fade, and Mara thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. The cold, the fear, the violence, but also the courage, the connection, the way they'd stood together when it mattered most. She'd learned something important in those long, hard months. She'd learned that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about finding something worth living for. And she'd learned that sometimes the people who saved you were the ones you saved first. Silas squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Mara smiled. "That I'm glad I found you in the snow." "Me too." They stayed there until the stars came out, and the valley settled into the quiet of evening. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Mara felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The years that followed brought their own challenges. There were droughts and harsh winters, losses and setbacks. But Red Hollow endured, and so did the people who called it home. Mara's infirmary became a fixture in the valley, a place where anyone could come for help. And Silas's reputation as a fair and steady leader only grew. They got married the following spring, a simple ceremony with Ruth and Emmett as witnesses. There were no grand declarations, no elaborate vows. Just two people who'd been through hell together, promising to keep going. And they did. Mara never went back to the cabin. She didn't need to. She'd built a new life at Red Hollow, one that was messy and imperfect in hers. She'd made mistakes, lost her temper, doubted herself more times than she could count. But she'd also found something she thought she'd lost forever, a place where she belonged, a place where she mattered. Because the truth, Mara realized, was that strength didn't come from being perfect or invincible. It came from showing up, even when you were scared, from choosing to fight, even when the odds were against you, from letting people see you, all of you, broken pieces and all, and trusting them not to turn away. She'd been running for so long, trying to outpace the pain and the shame, that she'd forgotten the most important thing. You can't heal in isolation. You can't grow when you're hiding. And you can't find your way home if you're too afraid to stop moving. Red Hollow taught her that. Silas taught her that. And in the end, she taught herself. On a warm summer evening, years after that first terrible winter, Mara stood on the porch and looked out at the valley. The ranch was bustling with life. Children playing in the yard, men working in the fields, Ruth calling everyone in for supper. It was loud and chaotic and wonderful, and Mara couldn't imagine being anywhere else. Silas came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. You all right? Yeah, Mara said, leaning back against him. I am. Good. He kissed the top of her head. Because I was thinking. About what? About how lucky I am. That you found me that day. That you didn't leave me in the snow. Mara turned in his arms and looked up at him. I think we found each other. Maybe, Silas said with a smile. But I'm still lucky. Mara laughed, and the sound echoed across the valley, bright and free. She was lucky too. Lucky to have survived. Lucky to have fought. Lucky to have found a place where she could be broken and whole at the same time. Because that was the thing about survival. It wasn't about coming through unscathed. It was about coming through it all. And sometimes the scars you carried were proof that you were stronger than you thought, that you'd faced the worst and kept going, that you'd earned the right to stand in the light. Mara had earned that right, and she wasn't letting it go. She kissed Silas, slow and steady, and then they walked inside together, to the home they'd built, the life they'd fought for, and the future that was finally, undeniably theirs.